William Harper sat alone in his corner office, the Memphis skyline glowing faintly through the window. The quarterly report lay open on his desk. Revenue up, cost down, margins solid. By every corporate metric, his logistics empire was thriving. And yet, his gut told him it was all wrong. He leaned back, fingers steepled under his chin, eyes fixed on a framed photo propped against the wall. In it, a much younger William stood shoulder to shoulder with his father, Jack Harper, outside the very first warehouse they had leased together. Jack's hands were still covered in dust and grease, but his smile radiated pure pride. "A good boss," Jack had once told him, "knows what it feels like when his hands bleed." William hadn't stepped foot inside a warehouse in over 7 years. His phone buzzed. Another customer complaint. Third one this week. Late shipments, damaged goods, rude workers. It wasn't just one location either. Most reports traced back to Memphis Distribution Center, the same facility that had once been the crown jewel of his operations. William frowned. He remembered every corner of that building, every crack in the concrete floor, back when he was the one loading trucks himself. He scrolled further down his inbox and froze. An anonymous letter, sent through the company's outdated whistleblower portal, signed only as "a tired pair of hands." The letter painted a grim picture. Hourly wages shaved off for minor mistakes. Workers terrified to speak up. A shift supervisor who treated the place like his personal kingdom. The writer ended with a chilling line. "We know corporate doesn't care, but maybe you will, if you remember where you came from." A knot twisted in William's stomach. He grabbed the photo of his father off the wall, thumb tracing the worn edges. Jack Harper had spent 40 years driving forklifts and stacking pallets. The kind of work that wore down your body but left your pride intact. When William founded Harper Logistics, he swore no worker under his roof would ever be treated the way his father once was. Invisible, replaceable, disposable. Somewhere along the way, that promise got buried under spreadsheets and stock prices. His fingers tightened around the frame until his knuckles went white. Then, without hesitation, William opened his laptop and booked a flight to Memphis. Not first class, not under his real name. This wouldn't be a corporate visit. This would be something much harder. By the time the sun rose the next morning, William Harper no longer existed, at least not inside that warehouse. When the HR clerk at Memphis Distribution Center processed his paperwork, the name on the file read Dan Harper. The man standing at the counter wore worn-out jeans, a faded flannel shirt, and steel-toe boots that had seen better days. His neatly trimmed hair was covered by a weathered baseball cap, and his face was clean-shaven for the first time in decades. "New guy, huh?" The clerk barely looked up, handing him a badge and a scanner. "Shift starts in 20. Good luck keeping up." William smiled faintly. He didn't need luck. He needed answers. The warehouse smelled exactly the way William remembered. Oil, cardboard, and stale coffee. The floor vibrated under his boots as forklifts zipped past, some faster than safety regulations allowed. Nobody gave the new guy a second glance. To them, he was just another temporary body, another pair of hands to chew up and spit out. A supervisor barked orders from across the loading dock, his voice a gravel scrape over metal. "Dan! You're with Monroe on inbound sorting. Move your ass!" William's stomach tightened at the name. Monroe. It couldn't be, could it? But as he followed the line of workers toward the far corner, there he was, a lanky kid no older than 22, shoulders hunched like the weight of the world had already broken his back. Caleb Monroe barely looked up when William stepped beside him. His uniform hung loose, 2 sizes too big, and his boots were worn to the soles. "Grab the top row," Caleb mumbled, voice flat, as if enthusiasm had been beaten out of him long ago. They worked in silence, lifting boxes, scanning labels, stacking pallets. Caleb moved twice as fast as anyone else, every motion sharp, practiced, survival over pride. Halfway through the shift, William caught him glancing at the clock. Every few minutes, a quick flick of his eyes toward the break room door, like he was counting down to something. When the lunch buzzer finally sounded, Caleb slipped away so fast William almost lost sight of him. Curious, William followed at a distance, blending into the crowd of workers heading to the break area. Most carried lunch bags or microwaved bowls. Caleb had nothing. He sat at the edge of a table, hands in his lap, eyes locked on the vending machine like it held the answer to all his problems. Then, after a furtive glance around the room, Caleb stood, walked to a trash bin near the rear door, and reached inside. He pulled out a crumpled paper bag, peeled it open carefully, and removed half a sandwich. Crust stale, lettuce wilted. William felt his stomach drop. Caleb took a small bite, chewing slowly, savoring every flavor like it might be his last meal. Before William could think, he was already beside him, voice low. "You okay, kid?" Caleb flinched so hard the sandwich nearly hit the floor. "I wasn't stealing," he said quickly. "It was already thrown out." William raised his hands in surrender. "I'm not here to bust you, just no lunch today?" Caleb's smile was a bitter twist. "Rent was due. Got paid Friday, but they cut my hours last minute. Dwayne said it was slow demand, but that's a lie. It's just how he keeps people scared." William's jaw clenched. Dwayne Pritchard. The name rang a bell. A shift supervisor with a long history of managing by fear, back when William still reviewed frontline reports himself. But those reports had stopped years ago, replaced by sanitized summaries from regional managers who swore everything was fine. "You've got nothing until next payday?" William pressed gently. Caleb shook his head. "I'll manage," but his eyes said otherwise. "And if you can't?" Caleb hesitated, voice barely a whisper. "Then I borrow, from Dwayne. It's how it works here." William had heard enough. This wasn't mismanagement. This was organized exploitation, a self-feeding cycle that turned desperate workers into permanent debtors. And somehow, under his watch, it had taken root inside his own company. When the break buzzer sounded, Caleb stuffed the rest of the sandwich into his pocket and hurried back to the line. William didn't move right away. He stood alone in the break room, staring at the trash bin like it might reveal all the answers. He had come here looking for numbers, missed quotas, faulty equipment, staffing shortages. But what he found was something far worse. This wasn't a business problem. This was a betrayal of his workers, of his values, of his father's legacy. Before the shift ended, William made a silent vow, not to the board, not to shareholders, but to Jack Harper. Whatever it took, no matter the cost, he would tear this place down to its bones and rebuild it the way it should have been all along. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. The next morning, William arrived at the warehouse before sunrise, blending into the half-awake crowd shuffling in through the employee entrance. His back ached from the previous shift, a dull reminder that he was no longer 25. But the ache was oddly satisfying. It felt honest, like proof he was exactly where he needed to be. Today, he didn't just need to observe, he needed to get his hands dirty. Dwayne Pritchard was already on the floor, barking orders before the clock even struck 6. He stood with his legs wide, clipboard in hand, looking down at his crew like a drill sergeant sizing up fresh recruits. His voice cut through the air, sharp and impatient. "Monroe, back on inbound. And you, new guy, stick with him. Try not to slow him down." William bit his tongue, resisting the urge to answer back. Not yet. Caleb didn't even react. He moved with the quiet resignation of someone who'd learned that the only way to survive was to keep his head down and his mouth shut. As they worked side by side, William noticed the subtle signs: a flinch whenever Dwayne walked past, a twitch in Caleb's hands whenever his scanner beeped wrong. The kid wasn't just tired, he was scared. Every scan felt like a potential strike against his paycheck. Halfway through the morning, a forklift veered too close to a stacked pallet, knocking several boxes to the floor. The driver, a wiry man with a nervous smile, jumped down and scrambled to restack them. Before he could finish, Dwayne was on him, voice booming across the floor. "You think this is amateur hour? You break it, you buy it, that's coming straight out of your check, genius." The driver mumbled an apology, head down, but Dwayne wasn't finished. "And guess who's staying late to clean up your mess?" William's hands clenched around his scanner. This was illegal, unethical, and everything Jack Harper had warned him about when he first started this company. But no one spoke up. Not the driver, not the other workers, not even Caleb. Silence had become survival. Later, during a short break, William found Caleb sitting near the loading dock, nursing a thermos of weak coffee. William slid down beside him, stretching his sore legs. "That box spill earlier," William said casually. "Does that really come out of his paycheck?" Caleb didn't even look up. "Yeah, happens all the time. You screw up, you pay for it. If you complain, you lose hours. Fewer hours, less pay. Less pay, more debt. It's a fun little game." William exhaled slowly, fighting the simmering rage building in his chest. "What about HR? Payroll? Nobody checks this stuff?" Caleb laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "HR works for corporate. Corporate listens to Dwayne, and Dwayne listens to nobody." Caleb took another sip, eyes fixed on the horizon like he was trying to remember what hope even looked like. "The only rule here is, don't piss off Dwayne." Before William could respond, the brake buzzer sounded, and Caleb pushed himself to his feet. "Welcome to Memphis," he said quietly, before disappearing back into the warehouse chaos. William sat alone, staring at the dusty concrete floor, realizing this wasn't just a broken system, it was a culture built on fear. And fear was a hell of a thing to dismantle. William followed Caleb back inside, but this time he wasn't just observing. He was calculating. Every shouted order, every flinch, every stolen glance toward the clock. It all fed into a growing map inside his head, a blueprint of exactly how fear ran this place. It wasn't just Dwayne barking orders. It was the entire structure beneath him. The subtle ways power flowed down through supervisors, into the shifts, and settled like dead weight on the shoulders of every worker who couldn't afford to push back. William kept moving, boxes in hand, sweat trickling down his spine as the heat of the warehouse thickened. Around noon, Teresa Watts arrived for a brief inspection, clipboard hugged to her chest like armor. She wasn't officially management yet, just a corporate liaison sent to gather operational notes for a future compliance audit. William remembered her file, former warehouse lead, promoted to regional training before mysteriously leaving 2 years ago. What he didn't know, until now, was the story behind her departure. He caught a snippet of conversation between her and Cody Hill, the veteran worker who'd been there longer than anyone. Surprised you came back, Cody muttered under his breath, stacking boxes. Surprised they let me, Teresa shot back, a tight smile not quite reaching her eyes. Guess Dwayne forgot to blacklist me. Cody snorted but said nothing else. William filed that exchange away for later. By mid-shift, the real problem came into focus. Not just the shouting or the arbitrary punishments, but the debt. Dwayne didn't just control hours. He controlled survival. Workers who fell short on rent, who needed car repairs, who couldn't make it to payday, were quietly offered advances. Loans, really, but with brutal terms. Every dollar borrowed came with a silent contract. Your silence, your obedience, your fear. William learned this not from Caleb directly, but from Nina Martinez, who quietly pulled him aside during a lull. Nina's hands trembled as she spoke, her voice low enough to be drowned out by the whir of machinery. I borrowed $200 last month, she said, not meeting his eyes. I've paid back $300 already, and Dwayne says I still owe another $100. He says interest goes up if you cause trouble. William's stomach churned. This wasn't just wage theft. It was a damn racket, a predatory system feeding off the people it was supposed to protect. And somehow, all of it had thrived under his name. When the shift ended, William lingered near the locker room, pretending to tie his boot while Dwayne and his assistant Troy Keller stood by the exit, counting cash. It wasn't subtle. Workers handed over folded bills, no receipts, no records, just fear disguised as obedience. Payroll's light again, Troy muttered, glancing at a crumpled paper. Corporate's squeezing us. Dwayne shrugged. They can squeeze all they want. I get mine first. William's hands shook as he stood. This wasn't mismanagement. It was extortion. And tomorrow, the man behind it all was going to learn exactly who he'd been shaking down. As William walked out into the night air, a strange sense of clarity settled over him. This wasn't just about fixing one warehouse. It was about keeping a promise he should never have forgotten. A promise to men like his father, to friends like Caleb's dad, to every tired pair of hands who built this company while William chased boardroom success. Tomorrow, Dan Harper was going to disappear, and William Harper was going to come back with a vengeance. The next morning, William stood outside the warehouse, hands in his pockets, watching the first shift arrive. They moved like shadows, heads down, feet dragging, the weight of another endless day pressing against their backs before they even crossed the threshold. William knew that weight. He had carried it once, years ago, when he was just a skinny kid loading trucks alongside his father. But back then, the weight felt honest. Hard work meant something. Here, now, it was different. This wasn't just exhaustion. It was defeat. He stepped inside, blending back into the line. But something had changed overnight. He wasn't just Dan Harper, the new hire, anymore. He was William Harper, founder and CEO, a man who had once built this company with his bare hands. And today, he was going to take it back. Dwayne was already on the floor, barking orders and throwing his weight around, his presence a constant reminder that fear ruled this place. William didn't need to wait for the perfect moment. He made his move right there, in front of everyone. He stepped into Dwayne's path, holding his ground as the larger man sneered down at him. "You lost, rookie?" Dwayne growled. "Back to work before I dock your first paycheck." William didn't flinch. Slowly, deliberately, he reached up, pulled off his thick-rimmed glasses, and tucked them into his pocket. Dwayne's brow furrowed, confusion flickering across his face. Then William removed his cap, running a hand through his graying hair. A ripple of silence spread through the warehouse, as nearby workers paused, recognizing the face they had only seen in company newsletters and framed photos in the front office. "I'm not lost," William said, voice calm but sharp enough to cut through the silence. "I'm exactly where I need to be." Dwayne's sneer faltered, replaced by something close to panic. "What kind of joke is this?" he demanded, but his voice lacked its usual authority. "No joke," William said. "I'm William Harper, and I've spent the last 2 days watching you run my warehouse like it's your personal fiefdom. That ends now." Around them, workers whispered, disbelief and cautious hope spreading like wildfire. For so long, William Harper had been a name on their paychecks, a ghost who lived in conference rooms 1,000 miles away. And now, here he was, standing in the dust and noise with them, not above them. Dwayne's face darkened, years of petty power slipping through his fingers. "You don't know how things work here," he spat. "You've been gone too long. You think you can just walk in here and—" "I can," William cut him off, his voice sharp with the authority of a man who had built this place from nothing. "Because this is my company, and today, I'm taking it back." Dwayne's hands curled into fists, the veins in his neck standing out as his face reddened. For a split second, William saw it, the moment Dwayne considered pushing back physically, maybe shoving him the way he shoved Caleb yesterday. But William didn't move. He held Dwayne's glare without blinking, standing tall, not as a CEO in a boardroom, but as a man who had spent his youth loading trucks in heat just like this. Whatever Dwayne saw in William's face made him hesitate. That was enough. William turned away from Dwayne and faced the workers who had gathered around, drawn by the confrontation like moths to a flame. Caleb stood at the edge of the crowd, his face pale with disbelief, fingers still gripping his scanner like a lifeline. William's voice didn't rise, but it carried. "I owe all of you an apology," he said, scanning their faces. "This place, this culture, it's my fault. I trusted the wrong people. I stopped showing up. And when I stopped showing up, you paid the price." The silence that followed felt heavy, but William didn't let it linger. "That ends today. Effective immediately, Dwayne Pritchard and Troy Keller are no longer employed at Harper Logistics." A low murmur rippled through the crowd, a mix of shock, disbelief, and something that felt dangerously close to hope. Dwayne barked a bitter laugh, but it was hollow now. "You can't just—" "I can." William cut him off again, firmer this time. "And I will. Hand over your keys. Now." Dwayne's face twisted in rage, but there was nowhere to run. He knew it. Everyone knew it. Slowly, he unhooked his keys from his belt and slapped them into William's outstretched hand, the metal clinking louder than any shout could have. "You'll regret this," Dwayne muttered, voice low enough that only William could hear. William leaned in, voice just as quiet. "Not as much as I regret letting men like you stand between me and my people." Dwayne turned on his heel and stormed toward the exit, Troy trailing behind him, pale and silent. When the door slammed shut behind them, the warehouse stood frozen for a heartbeat, as if the air itself didn't know what to do next. William broke the silence. "Payroll corrections start today. Every illegal deduction gets reversed. Every stolen dollar goes back into your pockets." He glanced at Nina, who stood near Caleb, her hands trembling. "If you paid Dwayne or Troy off the books, come to me. No retaliation, no punishment, just justice." Someone clapped, then another. Then it spread, a rolling wave of cautious applause mixed with disbelief and relief, like they were afraid to believe it was real. William raised a hand, calming them down. "This isn't the end. This is the beginning. Tomorrow, we start rebuilding this place. Together. His eyes found Caleb's, and for the first time since they met, the kid stood a little straighter. William's voice softened. And I have one more promise to keep. Tomorrow was going to be a long day, but for the first time in years, William knew exactly where he belonged. Dwayne's face flushed a deep, angry red, but William didn't give him the chance to recover. He turned, raising his voice just enough to carry across the floor, making sure every worker could hear him. Effective immediately, any money that was illegally deducted from your paychecks is coming back to you. Every cent. No more fines for dropped boxes. No more secret deductions. And no more off-the-books loans from your supervisor. The ripple of whispers grew louder, disbelief turning into cautious hope. Some workers exchanged quick glances, like they were afraid to believe what they'd just heard. William saw Caleb standing near the back of the group, arms crossed tightly over his chest, eyes narrowed with suspicion. He couldn't blame him. Promises were cheap in places like this. He would need to show them, not just tell them. Dwayne laughed, short and bitter. You think you're gonna win them over with a few sweet words? These people know the truth. They know corporate doesn't care. They know the only rule that matters in this place is survival. And you're just a suit trying to play hero. William stepped forward, so close Dwayne could see the steel in his eyes. You're half right, William said softly. They don't trust me. Yet. But you? They've been terrified of you for years. That ends today. He turned back to the workers, raising both hands to quiet the murmurs. I'm not here to make speeches. I'm here to work. I'm staying on this floor until every one of you gets the back pay you're owed, and until every crooked policy Dwayne put in place is gone for good. You want to know if you can trust me? Watch me. Dwayne took a step forward, chest puffed out, but William was already walking away, heading straight for the grimy office where shift schedules and payroll adjustments were kept. Troy! William barked, making the assistant supervisor flinch so hard he nearly dropped his clipboard. Bring me every payroll record from the last 2 years. Every hour cut, every fine, every deduction. Troy stammered something unintelligible, but William wasn't in the mood to listen. Now. The workers watched, stunned into silence. Dwayne stood frozen, caught between outrage and the sinking realization that his reign was over. For the first time in years, the warehouse floor belonged to someone else, and not just anyone, but the man whose name was printed on every pay stub, the man who built this company with his own hands. As William pushed open the office door, Caleb followed, hesitant but curious. Why are you really here? Caleb asked quietly. This isn't just about some fines. William paused, hand resting on the doorframe. Because a long time ago, I made a promise to someone a lot like you, he said. And I forgot it. I'm here to make that right. Caleb stood frozen for a second, caught off guard by William's answer. But William didn't wait for more questions. Inside the office, the air was stale, thick with the smell of old coffee and paperwork that had passed through too many hands. William yanked open the filing cabinet, rifling through folders until his fingers found what he was looking for. The payroll adjustment log, handwritten in Dwayne's jagged scrawl. It was worse than he thought. Entire shifts cut with no explanation, overtime slashed to avoid triggering benefits, and deduction after deduction marked with vague reasons like product damage or slow work. It wasn't sloppy bookkeeping. It was a system designed to bleed these workers dry, one paycheck at a time. Caleb hovered near the door, watching William flip through page after page. "He's been doing this for years," Caleb muttered, voice low. "Everybody knows it, but nobody can afford to fight it." William's jaw tightened. That quiet acceptance, that instinct to just survive, was exactly what Dwayne had counted on. "Not anymore," William said, slamming the drawer shut. "Go find Cody. Tell him to gather everyone in the break room. I want them all there when I explain how this is going to work from now on." Caleb hesitated, but something in William's voice made him move. When the door swung shut behind him, William sat down at Dwayne's desk, taking in the mess. Half-empty bottles of energy drinks, crumpled notes, a framed picture of Dwayne at some fishing tournament. For a moment, William almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Dwayne had probably started just like Caleb, another young kid trying to get ahead. But somewhere along the way, fear turned into power, and power turned into greed. It didn't excuse anything, but it reminded William that systems didn't just break themselves. People broke them. By the time William walked into the break room, every worker on shift was there. Some leaning against the walls, others perched on tables, arms crossed tight. Suspicion thickened the air, but beneath it was something else. Something William hadn't seen in a long time. Hope, buried so deep it barely showed, but it was there. Cody stood near the door, arms folded across his chest, expression unreadable. "I've been here a long time," Cody said quietly. "Seen a lot of managers come and go. Seen a lot of promises, too." William nodded. "I'm not here to make promises. I'm here to show you exactly what's going to happen next." He held up the payroll log, pages fanned out like evidence in a courtroom. "This is what Dwayne's been doing to you. Illegal deductions, fake fines, hours cut without warning. It ends now." A murmur ran through the room, disbelief wrestling with cautious optimism. William pressed forward. "Starting today, every one of you gets a full accounting of your hours and wages. If money was taken from you illegally, it's coming back with interest. And from now on, any changes to your schedule, your pay, or your job must go through the new warehouse manager, Teresa Watts." That name sparked louder whispers, some surprised, some approving. Teresa had history here, and everyone knew it. She'd fought Dwayne before, and now she was coming back, this time with William Harper at her side. "Teresa knows what it's like to work this floor," William said. "She's not here to scare you. She's here to make sure this place works for you, not against you." Caleb stood near the back, hands still jammed in his pockets, expression guarded. William met his eyes directly. "And if any of you have a problem, you can come to me. No more retaliation. No more fear." The room stayed quiet. Workers still processing whether they could believe what they were hearing. But William wasn't finished. "Dwayne and Troy are done here. And if anyone else in management thinks they can keep running things the old way, they'll find out how serious I am." He set the payroll log down, the sound sharp in the silence. "I built this place with my hands, and I'm going to rebuild it the right way, even if I have to do it one box at a time." He turned to leave, but Cody's voice stopped him at the door. "You talk a good game, Mr. Harper, but talk's cheap down here." William smiled faintly. "Then I guess it's a good thing I'm not done working." As he walked back onto the floor, William knew one speech wouldn't fix what years of fear had built, but it was a start. And tomorrow, the real work would begin. Not just for him, but for everyone. William didn't waste time after the meeting. He wanted action, not applause. The break room conversation was just the first crack in the wall Dwayne had built. But William knew fear didn't dissolve overnight. The only way to break it for good was to dismantle the system piece by piece, starting with the paper trail. Back in the office, he tore through every drawer, file, and cabinet, piecing together the puzzle of Dwayne's operation. What he found made his stomach turn. Dwayne's unofficial payroll adjustments went back years, farther than William had expected. The numbers told a story more damning than any speech William could give. Workers losing 2, sometimes 3 shifts a week without explanation. Overtime wiped out even when demand was high. Entire paychecks gutted by arbitrary fines that had no connection to actual damages. This wasn't just bad management. It was systematic theft, and at the center of it all was a separate ledger, one William almost missed, tucked inside an old shipping manifest folder. This one didn't track hours or wages. It tracked debt. Names listed next to dollar amounts, interest rates scrawled in uneven handwriting, payments made in cash only, no receipts. And at the top of the list, circled in red, was Caleb Monroe. William sat down hard in Dwayne's chair, the weight of it all pressing down on him. Caleb owed nearly $1,000, not to a bank, not to a payday lender, but directly to Dwayne. The interest alone could keep him trapped for months, maybe longer. And Caleb wasn't alone. Nina Martinez was on the list. So was Cody Hill, though his balance was smaller, a reminder that even the veterans weren't safe. This was the heart of Dwayne's power. Control the money, control the fear. William closed the ledger, anger settling into something colder. Resolve. This wasn't just about righting wrongs anymore. This was personal. He carried the ledger out onto the floor, the weight of it heavy in his hand. Workers glanced his way but quickly looked back down, old habits hard to break. William didn't stop until he found Caleb, stacking pallets near the loading dock. Without a word, he handed Caleb the book. Caleb frowned, flipping it open, eyes scanning the page until he saw his own name. His face went pale. He started, but William shook his head. "You don't owe him a damn thing," William said, voice low but firm. "This debt? It dies today." Caleb looked at him like he wasn't sure whether to believe it. "But I took the money. I signed under duress," William cut him off. "That's extortion, not a loan. And we're done pretending it's anything else." Caleb swallowed hard, fingers gripping the edges of the ledger like it might disappear if he let go. For the first time, William saw something new in his expression. Not just fear or exhaustion, but the flicker of something Caleb had long forgotten he could feel. Control. Caleb stood there for a moment, frozen between disbelief and the instinct to distrust anything that sounded too good to be true. William could see the calculations happening behind his eyes, the fear of false hope, the need to believe in something better warring against the reality he'd lived every day since stepping into this warehouse. But William didn't press him. Trust couldn't be forced. It had to be earned. William turned to the nearest work table and slammed the ledger down hard enough to make a sharp crack echo across the loading dock. Workers turned, startled, their eyes flicking between William and the worn, stained book lying open for all to see. "You've all heard the stories," William said, voice loud enough to carry through the cavernous space. "Some of you have lived them. Dwayne's loans, the disappearing hours, the fines that made no sense. It wasn't just bad luck or bad management. It was a system, and it was built to keep you scared and broke. That system dies today." Nina stepped closer, her arms folded protectively across her chest. "And what happens when you leave?" What stops the next guy from doing the same thing? William met her eyes directly. You do, he said. You, Cody, Caleb, every single one of you. We're putting in a worker advisory board. No more backroom deals. No more secrets. From now on, management answers to the people who actually do the work. The room stayed silent for a beat, disbelief still thick in the air. But Cody stepped forward, his voice rough from years of shouting over machinery. I've seen a lot of bosses come through this place, he said. But none of them ever stood here in the dirt with us. He glanced at William. You do this right. You got my back. Screw it up, and we'll show you the door ourselves. William smiled faintly. Fair deal. He could feel the air shift, just slightly, but enough. This wasn't trust, not yet, but it was the first crack in the wall of silence and fear. Later, after the shift ended and the workers drifted home, William stayed behind. Caleb lingered too, hands shoved in his pockets, shoulders still tense. You really knew my dad? Caleb asked quietly. William nodded, leaning back against a stack of pallets. He was one of the best men I ever worked with. Tough as nails, smarter than people gave him credit for, and loyal to his family, to his crew, to anyone who needed a hand. Caleb looked down at his boots. He always said you'd look out for me if anything happened. His voice was soft, but the accusation beneath it was clear. Guess you forgot. William's chest tightened. I did, he admitted. I got so caught up chasing growth and investors and all the things that didn't matter nearly as much as I thought they did. I let you down. I let all of you down. Caleb didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady. I'm not looking for a hero, Mr. Harper. I just want a job where I don't have to choose between rent and eating lunch. You'll get that, William said, and more. As they walked out together, the night air was cool against William's skin, but the weight on his shoulders felt a little lighter. Tomorrow would bring 1,000 new problems. Corporate pushback, resistance from old managers, fear that wouldn't die easy. But tonight, for the first time in too long, William knew exactly who he was fighting for. The next morning, William didn't bother with the disguise. When he walked into the warehouse, it was as himself. William Harper, founder, CEO, and the man who was about to dismantle the system that had rotted his company from the inside out. He wore no suit, just work boots, jeans, and a plain shirt rolled at the sleeves. The only thing different was the weight he carried in his posture. The weight of knowing how far he'd let this place fall while he chased numbers and quarterly reports. The air felt thicker than usual, tension crawling along the walls as workers paused to watch him cross the floor. Dwayne stood near the loading dock, arms crossed over his chest, jaw set like concrete. His usual sneer flickered between arrogance and uncertainty, as if even he wasn't sure whether William was bluffing. William wasn't. He walked straight up to Dwayne, stopping just a foot away, the hush falling over the warehouse so complete you could hear the low hum of fluorescent lights overhead. You and I need to talk, William said quietly. Dwayne's smile was thin and sharp. Not sure there's much to say. There is, William replied, holding up the ledger he'd taken from the office the night before. Like how you've turned my warehouse into your personal loan sharking operation. Dwayne's smile froze, a flicker of panic tightening his eyes, but William didn't stop. Like how you docked wages without approval, rewrote schedules to punish workers you didn't like, and built an entire shadow economy designed to keep people scared, desperate, and obedient. Dwayne took a half step forward, trying to loom over him, but William didn't move. You have no idea how this place actually works, Dwayne hissed. You sit in your fancy office signing contracts while we figure out how to make numbers fit reality. I did what had to be done. William's jaw tightened. What you did, he said, voice low and cold, was break the law, break these people, and break the promise I made when I put my father's name on this company. For the first time, real fear flickered behind Dwayne's bravado. He glanced toward Troy, who stood a few steps away, face pale and sweaty. William followed his gaze. Troy, William said, hand over your keys and your badge. Troy didn't argue. His hands shook as he unhooked both from his belt and set them in William's outstretched palm. Dwayne took a step back, but William blocked his path. Your turn, William said. Dwayne's face twisted in rage. You think you can fire me just like that? No, William said. I know I can. Dwayne's hand hovered at his side like he wanted to throw a punch, but he wasn't stupid enough to swing at the CEO in front of an entire shift of witnesses. Instead, he ripped his keyring off his belt and slapped it into William's hand hard enough to sting. You're making a mistake, Dwayne growled. You think these people are loyal to you? They'll turn on you the second things get hard. William's grip tightened around the keys, but his voice stayed calm. The only thing they were ever loyal to was survival. You made sure of that. My job isn't to buy their loyalty. It's to make sure they never have to fear people like you again. Dwayne's mouth opened like he wanted to argue, but no words came. The silence felt heavier than the loaded pallets lining the dock. Workers stood frozen, watching their longtime tormentor get stripped of power right before their eyes. For years, Dwayne had been the weather in this place. The storm they all had to endure. The force none of them could fight. Now, in the span of a few minutes, the sky had cleared. William turned his back on Dwayne, a deliberate gesture of dismissal, and faced the crew instead. From today forward, this warehouse runs differently, he said. No more off-the-books loans. No more fines without written cause. No more threats disguised as policy. I'm bringing in a new warehouse manager, someone who knows what it's like to work these floors, someone you can actually trust. He paused, scanning the crowd until his eyes found Teresa Watts standing just outside the office doorway. She stepped forward, shoulders squared, eyes locked on Dwayne with a calm, steady fire. Some of you remember Teresa, William continued. She used to work right here, until Dwayne ran her out for daring to speak up. Well, she's back, and this time, she's running the show. The reaction was mixed. A few scattered nods, some cautious hope, but also skepticism so thick it was practically stamped across Caleb's face. William understood. Promises were easy. Change was hard. As Teresa stepped up beside William, Dwayne barked out a bitter laugh. This place'll eat her alive, he sneered. They all want someone to blame when things go wrong. She won't last a month. William took a step closer to Dwayne, voice quiet but hard enough to cut steel. That's the difference between you and me, William said. You spent your time making people fear you. We're going to spend our time giving them something to believe in. Dwayne shook his head, muttering under his breath, but the fight was already gone from his shoulders. He pushed through the crowd toward the exit, and no one moved to stop him. No one spoke up for him. No one even looked at him. He had built this kingdom on fear, and now that fear was gone, there was nothing left. When the doors swung shut behind him, William turned back to the crew. This isn't the end of the fight, he said. It's the first step. Tomorrow we rebuild this place, together. As the workers began to disperse, Caleb caught William's eye. You really think Teresa can change this place? She doesn't have to do it alone, William said. Neither do you. They stood there for a moment, the weight of the day settling over both of them. Somewhere deep inside William's chest, the knot of guilt loosened just a little. He couldn't erase the years he'd spent looking away, but maybe, just maybe, he could spend the next few years looking right at the people who built his company from the ground up. Tomorrow, they wouldn't just be stacking boxes. They'd be stacking something far more valuable: trust. The next morning, William arrived at the warehouse before the sun had fully risen. The air was cooler than the day before, but the tension was warmer, thick with uncertainty. Dwayne was gone. That much was clear. But what came next was anyone's guess, and William knew the silence that followed any regime change was always the hardest to break. Workers filed in quietly, still adjusting to the absence of the man who had ruled this place through fear for years. William stood near the loading dock, hands in his pockets, watching their faces, reading every flicker of doubt, every guarded glance toward Teresa, who now stood with a clipboard in hand, her name freshly printed under the title Warehouse Manager. She didn't smile. Teresa wasn't here to play cheerleader. She knew better than anyone that change wasn't something you announced. It was something you proved, one decision at a time. She gave quick instructions, reassigned a few stations, then made her way toward William, her steps measured, her posture straight. "You really think they're ready to trust me?" she asked, voice low enough that only he could hear. "Not yet," William admitted. "But they'll trust what you do." Teresa's eyes scanned the floor, her gaze lingering on Nina, Caleb, and Cody. "I want them in my office after first break. I need a counsel." William nodded. It was a smart move. Build change from the inside, using the people who understood the floor better than any outside consultant ever could. Teresa had been one of them, after all. She knew exactly where the cracks were because she'd spent years working inside them. Mid-morning, William joined Caleb and Nina in the break room, where Teresa had set up a folding table covered in handwritten notes, old schedules, and a laptop loaded with payroll data. Cody leaned against the wall, arms crossed but eyes sharp, his skepticism softened slightly by curiosity. "Here's the deal," Teresa started. No preamble, no speeches. "We can't fix everything overnight, but we can fix 3 things right now: scheduling, wages, and communication. First, no more surprise shift cuts. If hours change, you'll know a week in advance unless there's a true emergency. Second, every deduction gets documented, approved, and signed off by both me and the worker affected. No more disappearing pay. Third, you all have a direct line to me. No more middlemen twisting your words. You got a problem? You bring it to me or William." Cody grunted. "Sounds nice on paper. Let's see how it holds up when things get messy." "They will," Teresa said, not missing a beat. "That's why I need you 3 to be the first members of the Worker Advisory Board. You'll meet with me every week. Tell me what's working, what's not, and what needs to change next." Caleb shifted in his seat, uneasy with the sudden responsibility. "I'm just a forklift driver," he muttered. "I'm not—" "You're the one who showed me what's really going on here," William interrupted. "That makes you qualified." Caleb looked down at his hands, fingers fidgeting with the corner of his sleeve. His instinct was to shrink back, to stay invisible. Survival had always depended on that. But something about the way William said it, the quiet conviction in his voice, made it hard to dismiss. Caleb wasn't being offered a promotion. He was being asked to stand up for people like himself. "I'll try," he said finally, the words small but solid. Teresa gave a short nod. as if she expected nothing more and nothing less. "Good," she said, sliding a printed schedule across the table. "First advisory meeting is tomorrow morning, before shift. Bring coffee. We're gonna need it." Cody snorted softly, but there was something close to approval in the sound. Nina, quieter than usual, studied Teresa with cautious respect. "Why are you really back?" Nina asked. "It's not just because William called you." Teresa's jaw tightened for a second before she answered. "Because this place broke me once, and I'm here to make sure it doesn't break anyone else." The room went quiet, heavy with the weight of unspoken history. William could see the shift happening, slow, fragile, but real. Trust wasn't built in a day, but honesty like that was how you poured the first foundation. After the meeting broke up, William stayed behind, scanning Teresa's notes, comparing them to the payroll files he'd spent the night reviewing. Patterns emerged. The same workers targeted again and again for hours cuts. The same names appearing on Dwayne's secret loan ledger. It was a list of the vulnerable, the ones who couldn't afford to fight back. William made a copy of that list and folded it into his pocket. These were the people he needed to talk to next, one by one, off the clock, away from the noise. If change was going to stick, they had to believe it was real, and that meant hearing it directly from the man who had once ignored them. As the shift rolled on, William didn't return to the office. He worked the floor, lifting boxes, scanning pallets, asking questions. He didn't give speeches. He didn't lecture. He listened. Cody told him about the time he was docked an entire day's pay because a truck arrived late, something completely out of his control. Nina explained how Dwayne's advances always came with strings. Take the money and you'd owe favors. Favors that usually meant covering shifts with no notice or staying late without overtime. Caleb, still wary, said little, but William could feel the wheels turning in his head. The slow realization that maybe, just maybe, this time could be different. By the time the afternoon break rolled around, word had spread that William was serious. He wasn't just cleaning house. He was staying. Workers still kept their distance, but the fear, that ever-present, crushing fear, had started to thin. And in its place, something quieter took root. Not trust, not yet, but the faintest flicker of hope. As William stood by the loading dock, wiping sweat from his brow, Teresa walked up beside him. "They're watching you," she said quietly. "Every move you make." "I know," William replied. "And they should." Teresa glanced toward the main doors, where Dwayne's name was still stenciled on the manager's office window. "We should take that down," she said. "Not yet," William said, surprising her. "Leave it up for a while. Let everyone remember exactly what we're not going back to." Teresa nodded slowly. "Tomorrow's going to be a long day." William smiled, tired but determined. "Good. Long days mean we're working. And this time, we're working for the right reasons." The sun dipped lower outside, casting long shadows across the warehouse floor. Tomorrow would bring the first official advisory board meeting, the first real test of whether the promise of change could survive contact with reality. And William knew, if tomorrow failed, everything they'd done so far wouldn't matter. But for now, in this quiet moment, with Teresa beside him and the first cracks of light piercing through years of darkness, William allowed himself a rare thing: hope. By the time William walked into the warehouse the next morning, the advisory board meeting was already underway in the break room. The door was propped open, and through the narrow gap, he could see Teresa standing at the head of the table, sleeves rolled up, hands planted firmly on either side of a thick binder. Cody sat across from her, arms crossed but his attention locked in. Nina took notes on a legal pad, her brow furrowed in concentration, and Caleb sat at the far end, silent but present, his fingers tapping a nervous rhythm against the table's edge. William didn't interrupt. He stood just outside the doorway, listening. This was their meeting, their space. If this board was going to mean anything, it couldn't be something dictated from the top down. It had to belong to them. Teresa's voice was calm, clear, no trace of the hesitation she had shown on her first day back. "We start with the schedules," she said. "Every worker gets a printed copy at the beginning of the week. No changes unless there's a documented emergency. Equipment failure, weather shutdown, something we can't predict." Cody grunted his approval. "What about overtime?" Nina asked. "People want the hours, but nobody wants the surprise shifts dropped on them 10 minutes before they're supposed to leave." Teresa nodded. "Overtime gets posted at least 24 hours ahead. No more guilt trips, no more take it or lose hours next week games." Caleb shifted in his seat, clearing his throat. "What about pay stubs?" His voice was quieter than the others, but everyone turned to listen. "Most people don't even understand half the stuff they see on there. Dwayne always said it's just taxes anytime someone asked about weird deductions." William stepped into the room then, no longer content to simply observe. "That changes too," he said, voice firm but not intrusive. "Every deduction gets explained, in writing. No more mystery math." The board members straightened slightly at his presence, but no one backed down. That was exactly what William wanted to see. "I'm not here to babysit," he said. "You don't need me to hold your hands. But if you hit a wall, whether it's corporate red tape or somebody in management pushing back, you come straight to me." Cody snorted. "And what if the wall is you?" William smiled faintly. "Then you push harder." The meeting stretched into the first break, workers drifting by the open door, curious but hesitant. Word was spreading. Something was happening in that break room, something that hadn't happened in a long time. People were being asked what they needed, and this time, someone was actually listening. When the meeting ended, the board members didn't linger. They scattered back to their stations, but William noticed how they stood a little straighter, how their steps were just a fraction lighter. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was momentum. And in a place like this, momentum was everything. The rest of the shift unfolded differently than any day William had ever seen in this warehouse. Workers weren't smiling, not yet, but they were watching. Watching Teresa as she walked the floor, clipboard tucked under her arm, asking questions and actually waiting for answers. Watching Cody step up to a younger worker struggling to load a pallet and show him a better technique instead of just barking at him to hurry up. Watching Caleb, who had always kept to himself, quietly explain the new scheduling policy to a small group near the vending machine, his voice still hesitant but clear enough for them to hear. It wasn't some overnight miracle. People still flinched when the intercom crackled to life, still watched the clock like every minute might bring bad news. Fear was a hard habit to break. But every time Teresa backed a worker up instead of cutting them down, every time a question got answered with respect instead of sarcasm, that fear lost a little more ground. William knew this wasn't enough, not yet, but it was the first time in years that hope felt louder than silence. Mid-shift, William rolled up his sleeves and worked alongside Caleb on inbound pallets. They didn't talk much at first, just moved together in the easy rhythm of people who understood that sometimes work was the only language that mattered. It wasn't until their second row of boxes that Caleb spoke. I looked through my pay stubs last night, he said quietly. Found 5 different deductions that never made sense. One said operational adjustment. Another said training offset. I never even asked for training. William's hands tightened on the edge of a box, anger simmering just beneath his skin. We'll audit everything, he said. Line by line. You're getting every dollar back. Caleb hesitated, then asked the question William had been expecting. And after that? After you leave, I mean. I'm not leaving, William said. Not until this place runs the way it should. And after that, I'll be back. Regularly. No more ghosts running this company. Caleb didn't answer right away, but there was a shift in his posture, a small, almost invisible release of tension. William knew better than to read too much into it, but it was something. Later that afternoon, Teresa called a floor-wide huddle, something Dwayne never allowed. Workers circled around her near the loading dock, arms crossed, skeptical but curious. This isn't a lecture, Teresa said. It's a standing invitation. If you see something wrong, if you're being asked to cover something up, take a hit on your pay. Or if someone tries to bring back Dwayne's old games, you come to me. If you don't trust me, go to William. And if you don't trust either of us, go to the advisory board. This only works if you use your voice. No one clapped. No one cheered. But they were listening. And in this place, listening was a revolution in itself. By the end of the shift, William stood with Teresa by the loading bay doors, watching workers file out into the fading light. They're waiting for us to screw this up, she said softly. I know, William replied. That's why we won't. Tomorrow wouldn't be easy. It would bring corporate pushback, tough conversations, maybe even legal threats from Dwayne if he decided to stir trouble. But tonight, for the first time in too long, the future of this warehouse belonged to the people who actually worked in it. And William Harper intended to make damn sure it stayed that way. The call from corporate came before William even made it to his car that night. He stood just outside the warehouse, phone pressed to his ear, watching the last few workers pull out of the lot, while Mark Reynolds, the company's chief operating officer, spoke in the clipped, impatient tone of a man who had never lifted anything heavier than a briefcase. I'm looking at the preliminary reports from Memphis, Mark said. Overtime changes, wage adjustments, advisory boards. William, what the hell are you doing down there? William leaned against the side of his truck, eyes on the fading light over the horizon. I'm fixing what we broke. Mark's laugh was short and humorless. We didn't break anything. This is just how warehouses run. You give people too much power. They start thinking they own the place. You think an advisory board's going to keep the lines moving? All you're doing is slowing down productivity. William's grip on his phone tightened, but his voice stayed calm. Productivity isn't the problem, Mark. Fear is. And fear doesn't make people work harder. It makes them work scared. Spare me the speech, Mark cut in. You want to play social worker, fine, but you're not doing it on company time. Effective immediately, any policy changes at Memphis need corporate approval. You want to rewrite the rule book. You bring it to the board. Fine, William said. Then put it on the next board agenda. There was a pause on the line, the kind that only came when someone realized they'd walked into a fight they weren't prepared to finish. You're serious, Mark said flatly. Dead serious. Before Mark could argue, William ended the call and stared at the screen for a moment, his reflection faint against the glass. There was a time, not long ago, when he would have worried about fallout, about stock prices, about investor calls. But standing in the shadow of the warehouse his father had once worked in, none of that mattered. The only boardroom William cared about right now was the folding table in the break room. The next morning, William walked into that same break room with Teresa, Cody, Caleb, and Nina already waiting. The advisory board's second meeting started with coffee and ended with a declaration. "Corporate's going to fight us," William said, setting his phone down on the table. "They want every change run through them. But this isn't about what they want. It's about what you need. So here's the deal. We write our own policies, right here, right now. We send them to corporate not as requests, but as decisions made by the people who work this floor every day." Cody leaned back, arms crossed, a slow grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Gonna piss them off." "Probably," William said. "But if they want to fight, they're getting one." Nina set her coffee down, her hands tightening around the edges of her notepad. "What if corporate shuts us down?" she asked, her voice soft but clear. "What if they threaten to cut hours or close this place completely?" William didn't hesitate. "Then they'll have to explain to the shareholders why they're killing one of the company's highest producing facilities right after its most profitable quarter. Fear works both ways." He let that settle, watching their faces as the weight of what he was asking sunk in. This wasn't just about better schedules or fair pay anymore. This was a line in the sand. Workers on one side, corporate on the other. And William stood right between them. Caleb shifted in his seat, still unsure whether to believe all of this was real or just another management stunt. "So we write the policies," Caleb said slowly. "But what happens when they ignore us?" William smiled faintly. "That's the beauty of this. They can't ignore all of us, not if we stand together. They can ignore a complaint from one worker. They can even ignore me. But they can't ignore every single person in this building. Not if you refuse to let them." Cody leaned forward, his chair creaking under his weight. "Hell, I've been here long enough to know when someone's blowing smoke. This doesn't sound like smoke. It sounds like you actually want to burn the old way down." "I do," William said simply. The advisory board spent the next hour drafting what they called the ground rules, the first worker-written policy guide in the warehouse's history. They kept it simple, focusing on the basics. Schedules posted weekly, all payroll adjustments documented and signed, no more unpaid overtime, and every loan or wage advance processed officially through payroll with clear terms and interest caps. No more backroom deals, no more fear tax. When the draft was finished, Teresa made copies and posted them in the break room, the locker room, even the bathroom stalls. "If corporate wants to argue, they can argue with all of us," Teresa said, stapling the final copy directly to the bulletin board where Dwayne's old production charts used to hang. By the time the morning shift ended, everyone had seen the ground rules. No one cheered, but there were quiet nods, small moments of recognition, proof that someone was listening, maybe for the first time in years. That afternoon, William sent the document directly to Mark Reynolds with a short message. "These are not requests. These are the rules now." Then he shut off his phone and went back to work on the floor, side by side with Caleb, moving pallets and lifting boxes, the same way Jack Harper had done decades before. When the shift ended, Caleb walked with William toward the exit. "You really think this works?" Caleb asked. "You really think they'll listen?" William rested a hand on Caleb's shoulder, feeling the weight of responsibility that belonged to both of them now. "They don't have to listen right away," William said. "They just have to know we're not afraid anymore." Tomorrow would bring more phone calls, more threats from corporate, maybe even lawyers. But tonight, for the first time, William walked away from the warehouse with his back straight and his conscience clear. William didn't have to wait long for corporate's response. By the time he walked into the warehouse the next morning, his inbox was already full of emails from legal, compliance, and senior leadership, all demanding explanations for the so-called ground rules. The language was carefully corporate. Phrases like unauthorized policy changes and exceeding managerial authority peppered every message. But the intent was clear: back down or face consequences. William barely skimmed the emails before closing his laptop. If they wanted to have that fight, they could bring it to Memphis. On the floor, the air felt different. Not lighter, exactly, but charged in a way William hadn't felt since his earliest days running the company. Workers moved with purpose, but without the tight, fearful edges he'd come to recognize over the last few shifts. Teresa was already walking the line, clipboard in hand, double-checking schedules with team leads and catching minor problems before they escalated. The advisory board was doing their rounds too, Cody checking the receiving dock, Nina fielding questions about time cards, and Caleb shadowing Teresa, still unsure of his role, but willing to show up anyway. At mid-morning break, William called an impromptu meeting in the break room, standing in the same spot where Dwayne had once delivered his threats disguised as instructions. The workers gathered slowly, some cautious, others openly curious. "I won't waste your time," William said, his voice calm but firm. "Corporate isn't happy about the ground rules. They want me to roll it all back, to go back to the way things were." He let the words settle, the tension building the way he expected. "I told them no." A ripple of disbelief ran through the room, but William raised his hand to quiet it. "I didn't come here to patch over cracks. I came here to fix the foundation. That only works if we hold the line, together. That means we follow these rules, no matter what corporate says. And if they try to change them behind our backs, you'll know about it first." Cody spoke up from the back, his voice rough but steady. "What if they fire you for this?" William smiled faintly. "Then they'll have to explain to every shareholder why they fired the guy who just turned this warehouse into the most productive site we've got." There was no applause. This wasn't that kind of speech. But when William stepped down, workers didn't scatter like they used to. They lingered, talking quietly among themselves, some sharing stories about old grievances they'd never dared mention before. For the first time, the break room felt like more than a place to kill time between shifts. It felt like something closer to community. After the break, William returned to the floor, not as the CEO, but as a worker standing shoulder to shoulder with his crew. He grabbed a clipboard and worked alongside Caleb, scanning inbound shipments and logging every box by hand, just to show the others that no task was beneath him. It wasn't about setting an example. It was about proving, through action, that the rules applied to everyone, including him. Word traveled fast. Workers who had spent years feeling invisible now had the CEO of the entire company unloading trucks next to them, sweating the same as they did. That meant more than any memo ever could. Mid-shift, Teresa pulled William aside, her expression serious. "I found something," she said, handing him a printed email that had been forwarded from corporate compliance. It was from a senior finance manager William barely remembered hiring, someone buried deep enough in the hierarchy that their name never crossed his desk. The message was short, but damning. Per previous agreement with site management, discretionary deductions may be applied at local discretion to offset variance in operational cost. William read it twice, stomach sinking. This was corporate sanctioned. The payroll manipulation, the wage theft, it hadn't been a rogue decision made by Dwayne alone. Someone higher up had quietly approved it, using vague language designed to hide the truth behind operational jargon. It wasn't just one broken warehouse. It was the system itself, and now that William had exposed it, the system was starting to push back. He walked out to the loading dock, needing air. Caleb followed, his face tight with the kind of anger that comes from understanding you've been lied to for longer than you realized. "So what happens now?" Caleb asked, voice low. "We go public," William said. "If corporate wants a war, we take it to the people who own this company, the shareholders, the customers, and the workers who actually make this place run." Caleb frowned. "That's risky. They could spin it, make it sound like you're just trying to cover your own ass." William nodded slowly. "That's why I need all of you with me. If this is just me, they'll bury it. But if it's us, if it's the advisory board, the whole crew, telling the truth together, they can't ignore it." Caleb was quiet for a moment, then said, "I'll talk to the others." By the end of the shift, William had what he needed: a signed statement from the advisory board detailing every violation, every shady deduction, every illegal practice that had bled these workers dry. Teresa drafted the document herself, and Cody, Nina, and Caleb signed it in front of the entire floor, making it clear this wasn't some corporate stunt. It was their truth, in their words. As William locked up the office for the night, his phone buzzed again. Another message from Mark Reynolds, this time angrier, more desperate. William didn't read it. Instead, he drafted his own message, attaching the signed statement and sending it not just to the board of directors, but to the company's largest investors and the media contacts he'd cultivated back when Harper Logistics was still the scrappy underdog. The truth wasn't a threat anymore. It was a weapon. And William Harper had just pulled the pin. Caleb stood at the edge of the loading dock the next morning, hands shoved deep into his pockets, staring out at the empty lot like it might hold the answers to questions he wasn't ready to ask. Behind him, the warehouse hummed with early shift energy, forklifts rolling, scanners beeping, the low murmur of workers adjusting to a reality where Dwayne was no longer watching their every move. William stood a few feet away, leaning against the doorframe, letting Caleb have his silence. "Feels weird," Caleb said finally, without turning around. "Like waiting for the other shoe to drop." "It probably will," William admitted. "Change never comes easy." Caleb exhaled hard through his nose, kicking a pebble across the concrete. "The others. They keep asking me what happens next. Like I know." "You don't have to know everything," William said. "That's why the board exists. You figure it out together." Caleb shook his head. "I'm not a leader. I just showed you a sandwich in the trash." William stepped forward, standing beside him now, both of them facing the horizon. "That's leadership," William said. "Seeing something wrong and refusing to pretend it's normal. Doesn't matter if you've got a title or a badge. Leaders speak up, even when their voice shakes." Caleb didn't answer, but the tension in his shoulders eased just slightly. Inside, Teresa was running through the morning checklist with Nina and Cody, while William prepared for the day's real challenge, introducing Caleb Monroe as the first worker representative to sit in on a regional management call. It wasn't just a gesture, it was a statement. The workers had a voice now, and that voice had a seat at the table. When the call started, the corporate team barely hid their disdain. William could hear it in the forced politeness, the way they referred to Caleb as Mr. Monroe, like saying his name too casually might invite chaos. Caleb, for his part, looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor, but his hands stayed steady on the table, his voice clear when Teresa asked him to explain the new scheduling policy they'd drafted. "It's simple," Caleb said. "We work the hours posted. If those hours change, we get a week's notice. No exceptions. No more surprise cuts." "And if demand shifts suddenly?" one regional director asked, her tone sharp with skepticism. "Then management can work the floor with us," Caleb said, not missing a beat. There was a beat of silence on the line, the kind that only happens when someone hears the truth so plainly they can't find a polite way to argue against it. William almost smiled, watching Caleb sit there, shoulders squared, voice steady, hands flat on the table. Not a kid begging for fair treatment, but a worker stating facts to the people who had forgotten what work actually felt like. One of the directors cleared his throat, trying to regain control. "We appreciate your input, Mr. Monroe, but these decisions ultimately need to align with company-wide policy and financial strategy." Caleb didn't flinch. "Financial strategy doesn't load these trucks," he said. "We do." William let the silence hang, watching the faces on the video call flicker between mild annoyance and quiet realization that this wasn't going to be the easy rubber stamp conversation they expected. Teresa leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. "The ground rules aren't up for debate. They're operational policy now. If you want to rewrite them, you'll need to do it here, in this room, with the people who actually live by them." The call ended with no resolution, just vague promises of follow-up and reviews, but William knew the real victory had already happened. Caleb had spoken, not just for himself, but for everyone on that floor, and he hadn't asked for permission to do it. When the screen went dark, Caleb exhaled a shaky breath and slumped back in his chair. I think I just pissed off every manager in the Southeast," he said, half a laugh under the words. "Good," William said. "They'll remember your name." The rest of the shift passed quietly, work happening the way it always had, but with fewer sidelong glances and fewer flinches when Teresa walked the floor. The next break room meeting wasn't called by William or Teresa. It was called by Caleb himself. He stood in front of his co-workers, hands still in his pockets, voice a little uncertain, but steady enough to be heard. "If something's wrong, speak up," he told them. "If they try to take back what we've built, speak up louder." Cody watched from the corner, arms crossed but smiling just a little. William stood beside Teresa near the doorway, letting Caleb own the moment. This was never supposed to be about one man saving a warehouse. It was supposed to be about giving that warehouse back to the people who built it, box by box, hour by hour. As the meeting ended and workers drifted back to their stations, William caught Caleb's arm. "Proud of you," William said quietly. Caleb shrugged, but there was color in his face now, a spark William hadn't seen before. "I'm just talking," Caleb said. "No," William corrected him. "You're leading." And tomorrow, Caleb would do it again. The sun was just beginning to rise when William stood once more at the edge of the loading dock, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. The warehouse was quiet now, the hum of forklifts and chatter of workers still an hour away. But William wanted this moment alone, to breathe it all in, to stand in the same place his father had stood so many mornings before. The air smelled the same, oil, dust, and that sharp bite of cold steel, but everything else had changed. Behind him, The break room bulletin board had been wiped clean of Dwayne's old warnings and punishment lists. In their place were the ground rules, printed fresh every week, signed off by the advisory board and Teresa, who had fully stepped into her new role with the quiet authority of someone who understood the weight of every decision. Next to it, a second board had been added, this one covered with worker suggestions, improvement ideas, and notes of appreciation left anonymously by employees who had once been too scared to speak up at all. William took a slow breath, letting the quiet settle deep inside him. There was no celebration planned, no big announcement. That wasn't what this moment needed. Change didn't need a ribbon-cutting ceremony. It needed to be lived day after day, until it felt normal. Until respect replaced fear so completely that no one remembered it had ever been any other way. The door creaked open behind him, and Caleb stepped out, his own coffee steaming in the cool air. He leaned beside William, their silence easy now, comfortable in the way only people who had shared hard truths could be. Caleb sipped his coffee, eyes scanning the lot just like William's had done minutes before. "Feels different out here," he said quietly. William nodded. It should. They stood that way for a while. No speeches, no forced wisdom, just the quiet understanding that both of them had earned this silence. Caleb glanced sideways at William, hesitating for only a second before speaking again. "My dad always said you were the kind of guy who remembered where you came from. I guess I didn't believe him until now." William smiled, the kind of smile that carried equal parts pride and regret. "Your dad believed in me before I deserved it. I'm not going to forget that again." Caleb gave a small nod, his hands wrapped around his cup like it was the only thing keeping him warm. "You staying?" William took a slow breath. "I'll be back. Not every day, but often enough. This place doesn't need me hovering over it. It needs people like you, like Teresa, like Nina and Cody. You built this place long before I showed up. Now it's yours to protect." The first car pulled into the lot, headlights cutting across the pavement. The shift was starting, the day would roll on, boxes would move, orders would ship. But for the first time in a long time, none of it would run on fear. It would run on something William had nearly forgotten could exist in a place like this: trust. As William turned to leave, he pulled a folded envelope from his pocket and handed it to Caleb. "What's this?" Caleb asked, brow furrowed. "My recommendation," William said. "Leadership training, if you want it." Caleb unfolded the paper, eyes scanning the first line. "To whom it may concern. I'm proud to recommend Caleb Monroe, a natural leader with more integrity than most executives I've met." Caleb swallowed hard, his voice a little rough when he spoke. "I'm just a forklift driver." "You're the guy who saw the truth and refused to ignore it," William said. "That's leadership." As William walked to his truck, the sun broke fully over the horizon, washing the warehouse in gold. Tomorrow, William would go back to the corporate office, to shareholder calls and quarterly reports. But today, standing in the shadow of the building his father once worked in, William Harper knew exactly who he was and exactly what his company stood for. The past couldn't be rewritten. The mistakes couldn't be erased. But the future, that belonged to the people who had always deserved it most.